Hey, Stormbounders. It's the start of a new season, so I wanted to take a moment and review the balance changes that are coming into the game in December. Uh, the first one, obviously, is the most important one here. Icicle Burst mana cost increased from 1 to 2. This is a reaction to the Javanna just being so prevalent and so strong in the meta right now. I think that the effect is still really good. I think that Icicle Burst into Javanna, even for a 6 mana combo, removing the unit, developing the free 8 strength, being able to then have 4 mana to spend on something else, it's still going to be good. I think that this just really disrupts the timing of the deck more than anything else. It was really, really easy to open on 3 mana with Lost Psyches, and to play 2/2 costs on 4, and to pretty much guaranteed having Icicle and Jev on 5. If you opened with Icicle or Javanna or both, it was fine because you could just keep those cards in your hand and spend your mana on everything else. Now, especially if you're starting on 3 mana, if you're going first, being able to keep Icicle and Javanna in your hand and try to hold it for 6 mana is really hard. It really limits what you can do with the rest of your turns. And so you start to really consider, can I cycle away Icicle? Can I cycle away Javanna and get it back on 6, get it back on 7 mana, and have a real power turn at that point? It makes it a lot harder to use. I think that for the most part, like I said, the effect is still going to be good, but because the early game consistency is going to be a lot more difficult because your swing turn where you're developing a bunch of tempo that makes it very hard for your opponent to recover from. That happens one turn later. I think that between the consistency and the delay, it's going to really do a lot to damage this deck. I think that this really changes how you build Javanna decks in the future. If the card does see a lot of play, I think you do need to slow it down a little bit more, be a little more defensive with your early game so you can have that power turn a little bit later. And it's a fine line to walk for Winter Pact because Gift of the Wise happens on 9. And if you're looking to Icicle Javanna on 7 and build your deck around that turn happening on 6 or 7, then you start to think to yourself, well, maybe I just put in a little more defense and play for Gift on 9. Um, I'm not sure how it's going to go. I do think that the combo will still be effective, but I do expect the play rate to drop dramatically, and I do expect the strength of the deck overall to drop dramatically. There's certainly some splash damage here as the Icicle Burst change now also impacts other freeze decks, stall decks, late game winter decks that are looking to just play Glacial Palace and Moment's Peace. So it looks like to compensate for that, Moment's Peace is now going from 5 mana to 4 mana, and the strength is adjusted accordingly, so it gets a little decrease in strength. I think that that's fair. Moment's Peace right now competes quite a bit with Blessed with Brawn. It gives a lot less strength than Blessed with Brawn. It does have the freeze effect. I don't think that the freeze effect is worth it. I think at 4 mana, it's now competing with Midwinter. So instead of freezing everything on the board, you're freezing a limited area, but you get a strength buff of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to adjust for that. And that's pretty fair, I think. What this tells me though is that Midwinter is probably not gonna see any play because Moment's Peace is just more useful if you have something on the board. Uh, but Midwinter already doesn't see a lot of play, so I don't think that that's a big change there. Ironclad gets a little buff with absorbing varmints. The ability is now going to be adjusted so it doesn't have to pull the unit in order to deal damage to it in the same way that Windmakers doesn't need to push the unit to deal damage to it. I think that this change is long overdue. I think absorbing varmints does actually have a lot of promise. I like absorbing varmints. I've always tried to make them work. The positional constraints on the card were just too great. You needed to be far ahead on board in order to use it. Your opponent had to have something, for example, in the middle row. You had to play absorbing varmints onto their baseline in order to hit that unit. It wasn't viable. Your opponent had to be on your baseline and you had to be on their baseline. Now you can just use it a little more flexibly. You still do have to be behind their front line, which is fine. Boomstick Officers has shown us that for a relatively inexpensive card, you can get behind their front line, play Boomstick, and do the damage, remove a unit while developing that forward tempo. Absorbing Varmints will now act in the same way. It costs 4 instead of the 3 that Boomstick is now, so it's a little less useful. Uh, but it pairs well with Boomstick because you can actually get this effect to go off multiple times, right? If your opponent is ignoring your threat on their baseline in order to try to close the game out quickly, you boomstick, you absorbing, you remove multiple units, you pull units off of your baseline if they're too big to remove. Like that's a really strong flexible option, a really strong mid-range option. I'm certainly going to play with the card. I think it's really good. I think it's really useful. I already put a lot of rodents in my ironclad decks. You know, Windmakers is in there. Oftentimes Ozone is in there. Boomstick could certainly fit right into that deck. You could put Erratic Neglects in there. You can actually get a lot of utility out of this card. Moonlit Aerie strength is increased. I think that this is fine. I don't play Moonlit Aerie. I find the slow buffing Satyr strategy to be ineffective at best. So giving the Moonlit a little extra strength for 3 mana, now it keeps up with the other 3 mana cards that can just flat out remove it between Westwind and Lost Psyches. It's so hard to get Moonlit to stick on the board. So I think this is totally reasonable. And I don't think it changes the play rate of Moonlit Aerie at all. Vanifall Spire will now poison 1 more unit at levels 4 and 5. So instead of 2 or 3 units poisoned, it's 3 and 4 units poisoned. I don't think that this does very much. I don't think that poisoning 1 more unit is really what was holding Venomfall back. It's a good structure. It has a good effect. The problem is that taking advantage of that effect just isn't quite there. Poison is always just 1 card away. I'll certainly be trying this out in the new season. I think that there's something there with Plague Monarchs. I think it's really close to useful. I'm just not 100% sure that this is going to put it over the edge and make it an actual meta contending deck. Obliterators and Salty Outcasts. We're going to talk about these together because they both are strong runners, heavy runners, 6 mana, 7 mana, 2 movement, both of them getting an extra point of power. I think that this is really actually impactful. I think that both of these cards, well, I think that Salty especially was just fine at 11 strength, and now at 12 strength it's very strong. I think we've seen this with the Shyvana meta, that Sleet Stompers with that 14 strength runner. It's just a giant chunk of damage. Salty's a couple of points behind that. For 1 mana cheaper, it's a giant chunk of damage. Obliterators now, for 6 mana, you can get 10. Like that's on par with Vindicators. That's actually better than Vindicators unless you get multiple triggers of the Vindicators, but the Vindicators has 1 more movement at least. This is going to be a really impactful finisher in a lot of Swarm decks, I think. I think that you're going to see Obliterators really take off. I think that this is going to be a very good card now, and all it took was 1 strength. I think that Salty Outcast now becomes that nice neutral runner that you can slot into really any deck. You're not sure what you want your win condition to be. Burst damage, is always a viable win condition. Just a big chunky runner that you can put in the deck and do a lot of damage with to close out the game. I think that this is in consideration for that spot now. What concerns me is that here on this list, I don't see Clap of Thunder. Uh, we're hitting the Shyvana decks with the Icicle Burst change, which certainly slows it down, which certainly indirectly hits Clap of Thunder. I don't know that that's enough. Clap is really good in other factions too. It's a viable card in Shadowfen, where you're playing that Acid Greenhorn Soap Cleanse combo. You're naturally playing a lot of small units. You're naturally trying to move through your hand quickly. You just slot Clap of Thunder in there, and now all of a sudden you have multiple buffs that get the job done. It's useful in Swarm. Swarm Rush with Clap of Thunder. I've always been a fan of putting one value generating card in a rush deck just to kind of help you in case the matchup stalls a little bit. Clap of Thunder is a great way to do that. The only faction I don't really see it in is Ironclad, and even there, I don't think that it's bad in Ironclad. It's just that Ironclad has other buffing options, so it doesn't really need it as much. Like Fort Tonic with Unstable build is pretty good already. You don't necessarily need the Clap of Thunder in there, but I bet it works, and it wasn't touched, so I do predict that we're still going to see a lot of Clap of Thunder in the meta. I do predict that that means that you're going to want that Hunter's Vengeance in your deck still if you're trying to play something slower. I do think that also makes a really good meta for something like Absorbing Varmints and Boomstick, where you're removing units while developing tempo, and that gives you stuff on the board that you can play Clap of Thunder into. It's going to be an interesting season, and happy hunting.